Welcome to Normalize You, your place to help us redefine normal. I'll be your host and your moderator, and I'll be here to help the world understand you and to help you understand the world. I just have two questions for you. What does the word normal mean to you? And how's it going, everyone?
What's up?
What's happening?
I'd like to welcome everyone back to another you hear that, John Squeak? I'd like to welcome everybody back to another episode of Normalize You. I know it's been a while, life be lifing. But we kept you guys anticipating the next, project. So we often talk about, like I said, the whole formula of this platform is, things that like we think should and shouldn't be normal. And on today's episode, I would like to know everyone's viewpoint on generational curses.
So for me, a generational curse is honestly something that's been like almost like programmed in a sense into like livelihoods. It's almost like crafted like over time, like into a belief mindset that you have to do and you have to keep going. And it goes from one family member or honestly all family members to the next family members because they're so used to this and they've become so accustomed to it. That's my thoughts.
I think when I first hear generational curses, it kind of has it has a negative connotation, but at the same time, it's more quickly attributed to minorities. Like you always hear it more in conversations directed towards minorities. So in that aspect, you hear it in terms of like, oh, nobody owning a house in a family for like 100 years is a generational curse because we're not taught to go for home ownership and things like that. I don't think it just applies to that though, because that could also be like the whole concept of what happens in this house stays in this house, even if what is in this house is hurting you. Like we don't tell people it's a good idea to go seek help even when they may need it. And that type of mindset carries through. So I think generational curses are those mindsets that we let carry through and affect us, even though we're supposed to be teaching the next generation to be better.
For anybody who goes real quick, Darian, because I saw your mic was muted real quick. I actually wanted to say, kind of piggyback on what Taylor was saying. It's a lot of times when you run into different households where, the grandparent would have an ailment, and then the father has that same ailment, and the son may have that same ailment, but they rather just suffer it out just due to the fact that, hey, my grandfather never went and got it checked out. He was fine. My father never went to get it checked out. He was fine, so I must be fine. And then come to find out that ailment could have been easily treatable, but just due to the fact that you're so stuck in this consistent ladder of, hey, he didn't do it, then it's like, I feel like I don't have to do it. And that's how I view generational curses, as a negative, where it's like we fall back on to us, which just seems like the easier option. But in reality, it's like, I feel like everyone should go ahead and just get it, especially if you know there's an issue, just go ahead and get it figured out. It doesn't necessarily have to be a health, situation. It could just be anything, financial, education wise. Just because somebody else did it don't mean you got to do it. Technology was different back then than it is now. The remedies that we had back then are way different now. The solutions to the stuff is way different now.
Yeah. The way I view generational curses, I can see where you're coming from that, especially when it deals with like ailments. But me personally, I feel like I don't want to say all, but majority of generational curses are learned. Like let's say you're in a family and everybody in your family drinks. Alcoholism runs in your family. Well, at some point you're going to, if you're influenced by it, at some point you're going to want to pick up a bottle of alcohol and drink. At some point you have to take it upon yourself to unlearn a habit that's been within your family, as opposed to it being like some ailment that you basically inherit through birth. It's more so something that's learned through the examples that you're given.
I definitely feel like that's an interesting point. My only thing that I guess the word learn just doesn't sit well because it's almost like, so the benefit and the sadness of a curse is the fact that like sometimes it's without your control and not within your control. I think for some of it, like so while yes, it's learned on the aspect of like these people are drinking, so I'm gonna drink. Um, like almost to Taylor's point, where like when you hear the word generational curse, you think of like minorities, but the truth is, when you think of generational curses, it hits everybody because like in non-minority ethnicities, um, they don't call it generational curses. They call it like normally just addicts, or they give it the specific definition. Like my family was full of like drug addicts, or my family has full alcoholism. They give it the specific name versus minorities like put it all under one umbrella, and I think it fits and comes really close to home to how Taylor was saying it, where it's like what happens in the cut stays in the cut. You know, like it is the truth is like, you know, it wasn't if you went back 40 years to like almost our parents' time, unless like their parents were progressive in the sense and was like, yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like go get help, go see a therapist, butt whoopings, and that was about it. Like butt whoopings and go cry yourself to sleep was what you got. So all the children that had ADHD, all the children that had like the basic things that are still technically generational were not taught appropriately. Um, and it was learned behavior, but it wasn't something they could shape because they didn't get the appropriate education. Like I feel bad for our parents because they were taught poorly, so they taught the next group poorly, which is what generational like curses look like. It's like it's not like no parent for the most part wants to say I was treated this way and I know there's a better way, but I want you to keep doing it this way. It's that they didn't know there was a better way, a safer way in the minority family is how I look at it. But that's just me. Oh, I'm gonna
I
sit
think
back. I'm
that
sit back.
brings up an interesting point when it comes to generational curses and what we're really referring to, because like you said, it's not necessarily learned behavior, it's almost experiential. It's almost like experiences, like whatever experience our parents went through, they don't try to change it, they just make sure you go through the same thing. Like it worked for me, so you're going to experience the same way I did. Especially when it comes to that whole the therapy mindset, like that's still something in minority cultures that is highly frowned upon, and everybody looks at you weird because we're like, why you got to go outside the home to get help? um so I mean, I think that's a important distinction to make, because like some of these things are just what they are. Like we weren't necessarily learned, they're not necessarily learned because we were never given any information. Like most families don't talk to their kids about home ownership and stuff like that.
Yeah, I know as a host, it's like I'm not really here to take sides or anything like that on a particular topic, but in the sense of what Darion was saying, I understand why Gerald was more so saying like, hey, this is why I feel the way I feel about that not necessarily being something that you're taught, because I feel like in my definition of generational curse, it's something that you learn. Like it's kind of like a recipe, right? Like yeah, your family can teach you specifically the recipe, they can teach you the exact ingredients you need, but then you also have those dishes where you just sit back and you just watch them cook. And then you keep passing it down and down. And the reason why that's more beneficial to being taught is because over the time, your taste is different than their taste. Your children's taste is going to be different from your taste. So the recipe then kind of grows just based on the fact you watch them do something. So in a way, you're getting your own interpretation of that particular dish. And I guess before we move a little bit forward, Mike, you want anything to say about that really quickly? Well, not really quickly, but I know you didn't get a chance to speak, so speak your mind.
No, I believe that most generational curses are just negative behaviors that are passed down through observation or the information that's given to the next generation or the the generation after that. Like the generation I grew up on, we grew up on each one teach one, no child left behind. We had certain methods that had orders. They had orders, and it was like we was taught patience through what we learned, and like we was taught to do things diligently throughout the 90s. And then so Then so moving forward to the early 2000s, and then we start to see the tech generation come along. Is like all of these methods that were passed down, like y'all were talking about earlier. It's like all these remedies and things that can help keep this balance. People don't do that anymore for other generations. Like they don't speak to these children calmly. They don't give them the right information. They just tell them, same as what Taylor said, because I had to go through this, you're going to learn this way. But most generations that are trying to teach those lessons, they don't even acknowledge that. They don't even remember the methods of how they were taught. So they're only teaching based off of the emotions that they built throughout that lesson from their generation.
I couldn't find my mouse for a second. Anybody else say something, Darian? Like you about to say something?
Yeah, as referring to like what you were saying about like how you can teach new ways, like it's like the saying, I can give you a fish, or I can give you a fish and feed you for a day, or teach you how to fish and feed you for a lifetime. Well, that way of fishing may not be as efficient as a new way of fishing, and sometimes the old way, because it works, can be stuck as, oh well, this works, I'm not going to change it. Like, although yeah, that may be something that works, if something else works better, it could be more beneficial. But because the old way still works, change doesn't really want to progress. And because that lack of progression, that's how some ways can end up becoming a curse rather than just being a teaching moment to teach you how to do something better, or to just give you a skill for yourself. The way that skill was given or the way it was taught could become a generational curse, because you're not seeking new ways to learn that can either be safer or more efficient, in a sense.
You got the little the poet snap.
Most definitely, because like that's 100% accurate. Like if you were to break down like just every inch of nugget that he just dropped, it would be in like Cliff Notes versions for anyone that would be watching this. They're like, what did I just hear? It's very simple. When you look at curses as a whole, curses are just the fact that like there are probably remedies to the curses, but because of the people that have been going through them for so long and realizing that they've been through it, they just keep giving the exact same line. So what is the line? Sometimes you have to be willing to attempt and try change in order to find a way out. And some more times than not, people aren't willing to try or attempt change, so they don't find their way out. And that's what Darion was saying, and I thought that was beautiful. So poet snaps again.
Every time you reach
I
for the
believe
mic,
that.
like you reaching like a baby trying to reach for a pickup. So
No, but that's exactly the issue with these generations in today's society, where the older generation don't believe that they can be taught anything new, and the younger generation believe that they know everything because everything's handed to them through technology.
anyone?
I mean, I think there's some like I definitely feel like what Mike is saying. There's some validity um, to his statement, especially to the aspect, not really the technology piece, but the older generation piece. Like the technology piece comes with the time. Like most of us were born in the '90s, so we have the insight of remembering like having to use AOL, but also watching the internet drop, having to like not be on the phone while somebody was on the computer, but also like having the first ever like smartphones. Like so, the '90s have the real like the '80s and the '90s have like the true uh focal point of understanding like the change in the times. I think the newer generation biggest issues when it comes to like isn't the technology, it's the avenue of freedom. So like, because there's been so much freedom, they don't understand the importance of listening or learning different avenues from the older generations. But because the older generations feel as if like everything they say is like law, it makes for the younger generations that have been dealing with so much freedom to not want to connect with it. Um, you know.
I think that goes to something that Jeff says, I feel like on every episode, which is it all has to be a conversation. And a willing conversation at that, because I think for me, and I'm gonna transition a bit. So Jeff, if you want to go somewhere else, you can cut me off. But like, I feel like the way to kind of stop some of the generational curses is the willingness to have the conversation, to think of new ways to fix this stuff. Because part of the issue comes from the fact that if even in just the older generation versus the newer generation conversation, the older generation has this stubbornness about new ideas because of the way they did things and how hard they had to work for them. So they don't look kindly on what they see as quick fixes because they feel like you didn't have to work as hard for it, so it doesn't mean as much. Whereas the younger generation is like, we found a more efficient way to get it done. We're not saying we didn't like the hard work, but we found a more efficient way to get it done. Why not think about it this way? And because those two mindsets are battling, the general curse just continues, because I think one of the biggest generational curses, regardless of ethnicity, is half of us don't know how to resolve conflict anymore because we don't know how to have a conversation. So I think in order to change the normalization of generational curses to the point where we just accept them, like we just are like, oh, what's your generational curse? Like, that's an actual conversation people have, and everybody can name off like 4 or 5 in their family, and nobody bats an eye. It's not uncommon. And I think to make it uncommon, you have to make the fact that it exists uncomfortable, which is a conversation that most people aren't willing to have because we're not willing to be uncomfortable.
That's why I
Yeah, I
always say,
think
before you go, Mike, real quick, my one saying that I always say is get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because then you get to see things from a direction that you don't usually see. Where it's like, oh, I forgot what exact quote it was that I heard somebody say, but they were saying that if you stop feeling like you're working hard, if you're not feeling like you're working hard, you need to change what you're doing. So I just want to leave you with that. Go ahead, Mike.
just goes to kind of piggyback off of what Taylor said. It's just like our generations grew up on hard work pays off. But nowadays, everybody's so getting attached to the work smarter, not harder, that they don't see that that's what paves the laziness to working smarter, because nobody wants to put in that hard work. And it's like the younger generation is just like, hey, we can try this method and it still gets done, but you're losing the information that leads the step by step to actually get the results done. We're just like, I work in the kitchen, and some fryers have an industrial way to clean them. Me and only an older gentleman up in there knows both ways to clean a fryer, whether we use the electric way or we have to use everything by manual labor. And because I understand each generation of labor, I'm the only one in there who they would call to go, hey, Mike, you mind doing this, or you mind doing that? Because I have the information, and it has to be done from a step 1 to step 8 basis. And that's just putting the machine together and then doing the other steps for cleaning the fryer. But with the 90s generation, I believe that's the only 10-year decade. That's the only decade of between the 50s and 2020 that was taught independence for society. It's like everybody else was taught groups. And then now that the younger generation has I want to work smarter. Oh, I want to be independent. I want to rush to being an adult. That nobody's taught patience throughout these other generations. So the generational curses, one of the main curses of each generation is everybody's impatient and nobody wants to listen to the next person saying you're wrong for doing this. and everybody agreeing with what's smarter to do, knowing that that's the lazy way. And it goes back to what Jeff said, is like that's mostly what complacency is. Everybody's comfortable with being lazy nowadays. Where my generation, we grew up on landlines. You know how patient you had to be when your sibling is on a phone or on the computer or doing something that you have to wait your turn for? Like, you had a each one teach one method. Now it's a, hey, just do what they're doing method. Now it's just do what they're doing. It's no longer watch and learn, and then everybody can learn the same method. It's just do what they're doing, and then everybody learns their own perspective. And it's no more thinking outside of the box or the outside looking into these generations. It's just probably us five, but we're probably like a 0.5% of society that sees this, right? And then the rest of society is like, what are they talking about? The older generation is like, oh, I see what they're saying because we did that. The younger generation is like, well, I've heard that before. And then it's always up to our generation to break these stigmas through behavior, where it's normal for people to be comfortable with just laziness nowadays. No, here.
I'm gonna push back on that a little bit because I think that independence within itself can be a generational curse. And the reason I say that is because sometimes we push people to independence so quickly that you're actually teaching them that they can't count on anybody. And while I understand that, yes, you should have some help, like you should have some independence, teaching somebody that they're alone in this world leads to depression and everything else. And we teach people that from day one. So I can't say that like our generation was taught independence and that's this thing to uphold, because putting it on that pedestal, half of us also were depressed because we were taught that nobody was going to have our back. We had to do it on our own. For instance, like most of us, you heard growing up, you got turn 18, you going to college, or you getting a job. Either way, you're getting out of my house. You don't hear that anymore. More parents are starting to be more accepting of the fact of let your kids stay at home while they go to school so they don't have the student loans. Or, oh, you want to go to trade school instead of regular college. We're starting to become more accepting of that again. Even though when we were first going into college, it was bachelor's or nothing. And now we're realizing that, okay, now we've lost this ability to do trade stuff because we didn't push that as much as we push books. Same thing's happening in the art industry. So I think we have to be careful of sometimes overemphasizing any one thing. Like too much of anything is a bad thing, because independence within itself could be a generational curse. And that's why I said, I think in order to change the conversation in today's time to normalize that generational curses shouldn't be normal, is to kind of have that uncomfortable conversation of why were we allowing this in the first place?
One thing I've noticed, especially when it comes to those of us born in the 90s, we tend to live in a generation where we're on the cusp of things. Like anybody who was born in, especially like the early 90s, we were born in an age where we saw the last of the analog age, and we grew up in the digital age, now seeing how the virtual age is kind of taking over that, and we're soon getting ready to move on from that. And it's like we tend to have this understanding of how the old ways work and the benefits of them, but at the same time, we understand the downsides to how the old ways had effects on us. So we develop new ways in order to do things, and it's like, okay, that's a better way to do it. But now we're also noticing that there may be bits of information that we couldn't get, like Mike was saying, because we didn't take those steps to get. And I don't think that's just a 90s maybe thing. I think that's like any generation that was on the cusp of whatever development that was coming up during their time. Like most generations that are usually on the cusp of that usually tend to see a more progressive side of life and trying to get away from these generational curses. But the longer that type of society stands, the more those ways that did work start to become stale. So it's like you only see progression when you see Like you only see progression in how we treat each other through our families and our peer groups when it comes to how we progress through society as a whole. So it's like when you have that progressive generation like the 90s or any other generation that was like the 90s of their time, you can tend to see a breaking away of generational curses. We're no longer products of our environment. Like we started off that way, but we tend to step aside from it as opposed to those generations where it's like there wasn't really too much progression during their time of coming up. That's when those generational curses actually start becoming curses. And we're all just products of our environment, unfortunately, and it's up to us in order to break those generational curses. We have to unlearn being a product of your environment that you were previously was, because no matter what environment you are, you're going to always be a product of that, but you have to decide what environment you're going to be a product of. You can't just sit and remain in your life saying, oh, well, I grew up this way, so this is just how I am. Yeah, we get it. That's how you were raised. But how you were raised shouldn't have as much of effect of how you're living now, because if you notice how you're living isn't very productive compared to how you were raised, then you have to take the step to change that. And that's how you get away from those generational curses, by becoming a better product of a better environment that you have yourself in currently. And if you don't take that into account, you're going to keep getting the same result.
So like more times than not, listening to like, you got a product of your environment, things of that nature. Because all this is like raw and it's real. But birds of a birds of a feather flock together is a real like a real life statement. And so it's like you can't take someone outside of an environment where they've spent 10 plus, 5 plus, 12 plus years and be like, you got to make this choice. What you're saying is correct. Like they have to make the choice, but what has to be understood in the broader spectrum is that if you have a 15-year-old person who joins a gang because their family's not treating them right, because two of their cousins and uncles are also in gangs, a 15-year-old doesn't have the mental stability or the understanding what the choices are for them to make. Also, a 15-year-old is under the umbrella of birds of a feather flock together because they're flocking with the family that is also selling drugs, running with the gangs, or doing things that are illegal, and that's all they're gonna know. And so, if you keep people on the path, like at this point, which I think like gets back to like where we were talking about, how do you like what are ways to break generational curses? It's like putting like if you're depending on what the thing is, putting different barriers within in front of the person to craft ways for them to work out the generational barriers. Let's say like everybody in the family just is a gang member as an example. One of the things for young people is to give them activities. Young people need to see themselves in things outside of what they're seeing in their environment. And a young person can't make that choice for themselves. They have to have people who are willing to put like themselves in the young person's shoes and see, oh, all right, you're only hanging around X, Y, and Z. You're only like messing with X, Y, and Z. Like I think of like Akila and the Bee, like the family that she, like the movie, obviously, where the people that she knew, or if you take into consideration, um, the Hate U Give, because the father came from a rough background in the Hate U Give, but knew he didn't want his kids to come from that same background. And even then, when you look towards the end of the movie, the son got to hop in the dad's car, but the daughter was treated differently. And so generational curses can like even bear like some form on not just ethnicity, but also gender. And so that's why I feel like we have to be cognitive of like what that looks like when once again birds of a feather flock together type thing.
Um,
Actually,
I'm gonna let Mike go real quick. I'm gonna let Mike say one thing, and then I'm gonna let Darian say something because I do have a follow-up thing I want to ask too.
I believe Jared is absolutely right, mainly because I've always just thought of that behavior on the outside looking in. I've never really interacted with it other than in passing. So we're just like, if if a guy hangs out on the street corner because somebody stop because somebody he knows is on that street corner, that's because they trust that person. And most people that I knew around the neighborhoods by the time I left them was the fact that they were willing to go back to prison, or they were willing to keep running that street corner or be outside with the fellas, mainly because they look at them as family. No matter if regular society like us look at that as a negative thing or unfortunate, or they're just on the wrong path, we don't look at that as normal. But that's normal for society to be like, oh yeah, they're selling drugs. Oh dang, yeah, that young man's going to be on a path. Like, we knew police officers that used to be like, hey yo, that young man isn't going to make it next summer. And some of these policemen were absolutely right, because they saw that these young men in the older generation weren't teaching them a different path or a new method or just to try something new. It's just, all right, they're fine with what they're doing. Let them lead to where they're going. They're going to learn a lesson, but you can't learn a lesson if you die. Like, nobody really gets that. That's where that leads to. Like, everything that we talk about, it leads to somebody strung out on drugs, or somebody's relative being put in the home because nobody wants to have the patience to take care of them, or somebody's child is neglected because the grandparent isn't fit enough, or the parent isn't mentally stable enough, or their emotional balance. Just like, everything is trickled down from, absolutely, from what y'all said earlier, where it's just like us taught in the 90s, we're taught to be independent, but some of us actually learn to stay that way because it's what's best for us. Like, we can always stay independent, help others, stay independent, help ourselves, stay independent, try this new, stay independent. All right, I did this, and then go right back to our regular complacency of being comfortable. It's like, we independently choose to be uncomfortable, like what Jeff said, where we'll have to make the choice to be uncomfortable and be like, all right, I done put myself here and I gotta rock through this lesson. And then once it's over, then all right, lesson learned. But it's like the older generation before us and then the young generation after us, they do a lot of dwelling. Stop. They do a lot of dwelling, whether it's negative or positive, and reminiscing is stuck in the past too.
So, Gerald, in response to what you were saying to what I said, you are actually absolutely right, and I do agree with you. But what I was more so speaking towards was the person is already out of that environment. Like, not that they have to be given the chance to get out, but that they're already out of that environment. They've already taken that chance. They're no longer with the flock. But once they're out of the flock, they still try to find another flock that's similar to the flock they just left, rather than a flock that's like-minded towards the goal that they're trying to reach. Take, for example, the movie Higher Learning. Malik was the first person in his family to go to college. Nobody else had gone but him. But when he gets there, he's running track, he's doing this thing, he went there on a scholarship, but he has a better opportunity. While he's there, he starts hanging out with people that have the same type of mindset, with people from the hood that he came from, rather than just focus on what his goal was. He allowed himself to get sucked right back in to this very same environment that he worked his butt off to get out of. And my point was, once you leave that environment that you know is unhealthy, you have to take it upon yourself to move towards a better environment, since you're in a better one. Now, if you aren't, I'm not going to say there's not much you can do, but you got to work towards it. But if you're already in that new and better environment, you have to take it upon yourself not to allow others to influence you back into that same behavior, back into that same perspective, or else You're literally just moving from one place to another, not really learning anything. Yeah, your setting is better. It looks different. It looks look like this. Gentrification in the hood. Putting a Starbucks on Benning Road ain't gonna change the fact that it's still Benning Road. You have to put yourself in a better mindset to work towards the perspective in which you want once you're out of that flock that you flock with. If you don't, you're going to end up finding the very same flock just in a better environment, and it's actually going to look even worse because you're in a more pristine environment doing the same raggedy stuff that you were doing. Now it looks even worse on you because it looks like you don't know how to behave, rather opposed to you behaving that way because that was the only way to survive. Now you're just looking like you have no home training.
Hold on, Mike. I know you want to say something, but let me say this real quick. Did you have a response to that, Gerald? Before I say this, it'll be quick if you wanted to say something.
I do, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, it's pretty much like an example of what Darian was saying. I'm gonna put it. I'm not saying this is exactly what he's saying, but this is my interpretation of what he was saying. It's equivalent to a basketball hoop. We all have seen a basketball court, and if you're in one of those better areas, you're going to see 90% of the time the nets or chain, whatever they use, still intact fully. But then you go to those lesser areas, and I'm talking about lesser in the sense of like financial. You're going to see the courts are like more so always like dilapidated, or like the rim is hanging off, or the net. And you keep, no matter how many times you put the net back up, you're going to come back and the net's going to still be destroyed. So like Darren was saying, it's like, yeah, you're trying to change something just by throwing an image out there instead of doing something about the change to change it. Because if you talk to people at the basketball court and like, hey, why do you keep tearing these nets down? If you have that conversation with them, if you come back again later, you'll see that net is no longer torn down. Or on a negative sense of it, or negative aspect of it, you get to the point where you just stop putting the net up altogether.
So Gerald, before you go, I'm gonna say something. We've brought up the 90s a lot, and for everybody watching, I don't want you to feel like we're specifically just saying it's 90s versus everybody and we're like the greatest generation ever. Like every generation had their strengths and weaknesses, and the reason we're bringing up the 90s is a point of reference for what we're trying to describe, mainly because there was so much change that was happening during that time in such a quick amount of time that drastically changed the way life was considered normal. Like we went from landlines to cell phones very quickly. So that's more of an example. But like Darian pointed out earlier, every generation that's been on the cusp of that type of change has gone through these same things that us as 90s kids are going through. For instance, my mother was growing up right after Civil Rights Bill came out. So that's another cusp of a huge change. Also, this isn't good. We're not specifically saying minorities are the only ones that have generational curses. I think one thing that's come up a lot is that a lot of people are recognizing that almost every ethnicity, every gender has a generational curse when it comes to mental health, because we just refuse to address it and refuse to accept it as a thing for so long. So I just want to throw that in there because I know we're speaking a lot from a little bit of our personal experiences, and you can only speak from what you can see in that intelligent way unless you've studied it another way. So in order to not offend by speaking about something incorrectly, we're using what we know to translate into a story and example for you guys. So don't feel attacked, older generation, younger generation, don't feel praised, vice versa. It's just context.
No, to piggyback what you're saying, Taylor, the whole premise of this platform is to speak about what we think are social norms, things that shouldn't be normal, what makes us normal, what we think is normal, right? So you're often going to hear us talk about stuff that we're passionate about. You're going to hear us talk about stuff that usually follows between whatever age group you see on this panel. That's why it's important for you as, the audience, not just an audience, as an audience to come on and tell us, in the comments and everything like that, or in the DMs, let us know, hey, this is what we feel. Can you have a particular episode about this just based on your particular thoughts? But if you don't do that, then we're only going to be able to give inputs on how we feel about certain things. So when you look at the episodes and say, hey, Why are they talking about stuff from the 80s? Why are they talking about stuff from the 90s? Why are they talking about what it's like to be black? Why are they talking about what it's like to be a male? What it's like to be a female? It's like you're creating, you're letting us dictate the episodes, which we do want to do, but at the same time, it's like we're giving you the viewers a chance to speak up too, because I can only speak about what experiences I have been through. I can't guess what James from 30 years ago did. I don't know that person until James comes into the comments and says, hey, X, Y, and Z, you know? So everything we talk about, I'm trying to prevent us from having to do a disclaimer a lot, because a lot of people in the world is like, they don't always get it. And you have to do a little bit of explaining, which I'm okay to do, because at the end of the day, everybody doesn't understand things on the same level as everyone else. But until people start coming in and letting us know what they would like us to talk about, or join the panel yourself as a guest to talk about things you want to talk about, we're only going to be able to talk about things from like how we view things. And with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and let Dragon Ball Z hoodie, he about to say something real quick. Unless you're about to say something about what I just said.
Actually, I
Uh,
was.
Go ahead, Darion. Because I feel
Um,
like what I'm gonna say is gonna take a minute.
everything we say on here is entirely our opinion. We've said this before, but for anybody that gets the wrong idea, we aren't being condescending. Everything is our opinion, and that's exactly what it should be for you. We want you to hear our opinions because we value yours. This is a safe place for you to share those opinions without feeling invalidated or misconstrued or like you have no voice. Now, if we say, oh, well, this is that and that's that, our opinions are always going to be reinforced by the facts that we do know. But if you have an opposing opinion about something that has other facts, be more than welcome it. But our opinions are our own, just like yours are yours. That's why we created this platform, because it's for your normal, and your normal is based in your opinion.
Good point. So go ahead, Joe. Go ahead, do your thing, Dragon Ball Z hoodie.
Hey, listen, because I'll be writing notes. Because I didn't want to forget my thoughts. But no, so there was a lot of stuff being said, and so when we started all this, we were talking about generational curses, and so one of the things that I think Darion and Mike was touched on was like explaining the aspect of just how for older people when they get into like newer environments, like I think Darion mentioned higher learning. One of the things that uh and Mike mentioned school days is what I wrote. One of the things that I think sometimes are forgotten is within generational curses and within like people that are trying to break those is specifically these things, and I'm going to touch on each one, but it's conversation, views, aspects, connections, relationships, and expectations. Um, because you can go your whole life, just like you mentioned for higher learning, and then get to a better place. And being the first one of someone like anywhere is cool. But the truth of the matter is, if you're the first, then you still have every generation behind you of information with you. And so if you've never seen, so if your views that you've had people to show you what it looks like to be successful in the eyesight of you, like people that to be successful, it's going to be tough to break that generational curse. If you don't have the connections with people, it's going to be hard to break that generational curse. When Jeff was talking about like sometimes you got to get comfortable with having the uncomfortable conversations. If you're not having conversations about being the first and the like hardships of it, even when you put yourself into that place, you're not going to have it. If you don't have relationships that are strong enough just on people to support you, you're not going to be able to grow. And finally, if you don't have the expectations that come along with it, you're also not going to be able to break these curses. Like the first four letters in generational is literally GENE, which is the gene. And so it's ironic that gene is the first word as we look at like the family genes that we're talking about when breaking generational curses, because them as a whole, like the curse as a whole, the entity of addiction, of like education, of like abuse, all of these different things, mental health that we talk about and touch on, are, if you don't have those aspects you're working on first, you're not going to be able to break it. Like, we like to tell people, once you get to 20, like once you've left, the hood, then like when you get to a newer place, then you should be all right to like find it for yourself. But the truth is, if you don't have things that I mentioned first, once you leave those places, the truth is you're going to go back to what you feel comfortable with. And that's the issue, because what you're
100%.
comfortable with is the curse. That's, people don't want to talk about that though. Like, what you're comfortable with is the pain. Like, you look at, like, unfortunately, uh men and women that go back to like toxic relationships, not because like, it's what's right for them. It's because it's what they're comfortable with. Because they didn't have conversations with people who have been treating them healthy. They haven't had the relationships and connections with people that are healthy. So when they get put in front of healthy, they're like, oh, and then they like freak out, freeze up, and then it makes them more uncomfortable. And so, like, one of the things that I wanted to make sure we said were like, these are the things, from my personal opinion, I think that you have to work on to first actually break generational curses. And I just want to repeat them again, and then I'm done talking. Conversations, like, you gotta have conversations with people that, one, aren't like, kind of like we're doing, like, that may not think like you, but also can see from objective views. Like, you have to view what you're going through objectively, because when you start to view what you're going through personalized and individualized, you lose sight of the importance of your individuality. The aspects are just like overall how the situation looks. Like, I know you're used to it, doesn't mean you should be. And then you got to find connections with sometimes people that are going through situations and what they've done to work through it, and sometimes just like people who are wanting to support you, because relationships are just as important as the connections you have with these people. And then you have to put yourself, which I think, Darion, you've been talking a lot about, and Mike, is to the expectation, but you can't get to the expectation point. Like, you can't skip the expectation until you get at least two or three of these other things under your belt. And that's just how I felt.
I think that's a great way to kind of summarize how to deal with generational curses. And, I especially like the way you broke it down, because I think also that doesn't just apply to like personal relationships. Like, I think me and Jeff have talked about how this even applies in the workforce. Like, half of the workforce you hear all the time is it's about who you know. There's a reason it's about who you know, because those people that made it far or were able to do things are able to teach you a different way that everybody else wasn't willing to do. They made themselves uncomfortable. And again, it goes to something that just says all the time, is like, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Like, yeah, these things aren't easy. They're not supposed to be. So you gotta, if it's easy, you're doing it wrong.
Hey, I'm stupid, so stop referencing me so people think I'm smart.
Says the host and the CEO. All right. So anyway, but yeah, you have to be like, we have to get okay with it, because there's a lot of things that people just didn't even think of. Like, even as Darion brought up, movies where somebody was breaking out of their environment into a new environment. You have to surround yourself with the right people when you do that, because your own family could be like, oh, you just out there thinking you all big and bad because you in college. Because none of them ever did it. So they're already creating a negative vibe, and that's going to make you not want to stay, because your own family is already talking to you like that. So if you don't prepare yourselves for how to break out, when you get out, you're going to fall right back in. We say the same thing with school to prison pipelines and things like that. Like, if you don't know no better and you don't work on these tools and actually work on them, not expect somebody just to give you a, hey, here's the cheat code, like, this is a freaking video game from PS2 and here's my cheat book. Like, if you don't work on them, you're always going to fall back into them.
Hold on, Darren, because I actually do want to, because I'm looking at the times that we put in the group chat to make sure we're all ready for this episode, and I know we're encroaching on that time. So I'm gonna end it with this, not end it, but more so segue into the ending. How do we have a dialogue with people that we think should change, or how do we have a dialogue as people that want to change, or what dialogue do we have with people that want to change and want to look for how to change?
By basically speaking on the things that we just spoke on, like as you spoke on some months ago, Jeff, we talked about how we need to focus on controversy, where everything that we just spoke on, where generational curses, it's not a positive subject. It's not in no way, shape, form, or fashion, because they have a generational negative effect on not just families, but clearly generations. And it's like, it has to be broken either by like, and again, this goes back to why we brought up the 90s generation. It either has to be broken by our parents or us or our children, right? Just from us timeline wise, it has to be broken by either our parents had to break it so we can show something different now, and then we have to break it so that our children can break it. So it's like, whatever generational curse is broken, that method should be taught to be passed down. It's like, you can break the generational curse and then still not break it at all if that perspective or mentality doesn't grab it. But if we just focused on like, if we could focus on the real things like now, then that should be like the, I guess, the easy, difficult task for us, because if it's easy, then it really, like, you really ain't doing it right. All right. Like, if you can ride a bike down the hill without pedaling, but until you grab one of them handlebars, or you got the old school brake pedals, you're not gonna stop, because why? You don't have that knowledge or that experience. Anybody can roll a bike down the hill, but until you know how to control it, you're gonna either keep going or you're gonna fall as soon as you start to pedal.
Yeah, I think in order to even have that conversation, as a people, not just individually or anybody else here, but as a people, as in just people in general, we have to get out of our heads of even being embarrassed about asking the question that starts the conversation in the first place. If you know that you need to ask a specific question to an older generation that was in charge of watching you or raising you, and you're trying to break a generational curse, you have to get yourself out of the mindset of, oh, I'm going to be judged. So what? You're going to be judged. If you let that bother you, you won't even be able to get to the question that you need to ask in the first place, let alone even be able to get an answer. And even if you get the wrong answer from them, you can build on that to getting the right answer. But if you don't get out of your own head about being judged, about being embarrassed, if you constantly have a complex about even speaking up in the first place, and I can tell you that from firsthand experience, about having some type of complex about even speaking up on things you got a problem with, you aren't going to even be able to initiate that change, let alone make it. Now, I also had something I wanted to say in response to what Taylor was saying, kind of an example that kind of reinforces what I just said. One thing that was definitely a problem for me when I was in the military, I didn't want to speak to the family members that I had that were either already in or went to the military. Mainly the reason because before I even went, I was always the kid to say I might respect the people that serve, but after the military, I'll never go, I'll never join. Lo and behold, I did 5 years. But one of my biggest mistakes was not reaching out to the people that have already been where I was. Yeah, I didn't do as bad as I thought things were going to go, but I definitely could have gone a lot further in my career had I just spoken up and asked the questions that I had. And because of that, I didn't get where I wanted to go.
But honestly, Darian, you don't put that on yourself, because we just explained that that's our generation. We were taught independence, and we were taught to stay independent. So you can't blame yourself from not making a choice where they didn't show you how to open up to them. You can't put that on yourself. You made a choice and you stood by your choice. And you did an extra year more than any generation, any of this generation is even wanting to do. I speak to hundreds of Marines nightly and daily. You think they have a plan when they get out of their first 4 years? No. Your plan, you went back a whole nother year and then you lived your life. So you can't put that on you from the neglect of a beginning generation they chose to do for you. They knew that you was going in the service. They knew that you were in the service. They knew that you were out of the service. So the simple fact that you were in and they didn't say nothing and you were out and the conversation still hasn't came up, you can't put that on you. You succeeded for what choice you made from your generation era, bro. You can't be like, oh, you should have done this or you should have done that. No, you did exactly what you did because that's your generation. You're a 90s kid. You were taught what they showed you. They didn't show you what we do to each other right now. They didn't show you to open up or tell somebody the truth about themselves, whether or not it's going to hurt them or not. They didn't teach you that. They told you to guard up and be a man.
Correct. I know you want to respond, Darion, but
time.
they do have to go. So I'm gonna let them go inside. I'm gonna explain to you in a minute after I say trust me. Go ahead. What is your if you heard the question, Gerald, what is your closing remark on that?
My closing remark.
No, Gerald, hold on, Darren. I'm gonna explain to you in a minute.
So my closing remark to everything is because I feel like, you know, nigga be taking notes, but like, so I wish I could remember who told me this, but one of the things that people have to truly get comfortable with is failing. And I wish I could say I came up with this cool acronym, but I didn't. And FAIL stands for first attempt in learning. Because a lot more times than anything, it goes back to how Darion was talking about the judging part. We as a whole for the question have to get comfortable with like learning the things we didn't know and failing at the things that we're going to learn in the process. And the only way that can happen is by having these conversations and being okay with not knowing everything at first.
I wanted to add, see something, say something. And the reason I add that, and obviously that's not my quote, was kind of a response to what Mike was saying. If you see a problem and you see the solution, speak up. Whether you're speaking up with your voice, speaking up with your actions, if you see the solution, use it. Don't just sit there because you're afraid to use it because you haven't done it before. Even if you think you might fail, like Gerald said, first attempt is learning, right? See something, say something, whether it's with your voice or actions. Do something different, do something better. If you can't, go somewhere where you can figure it out. If you don't know where, find someone who does. But if you have the answer, apply it. Apply it, apply it, apply it. And I'm telling you that from firsthand experience from my life. If you have the answer, apply it. You will thank yourself later.
And on that note, Taylor, do you have any closing remarks in regards to, like you said, how do you have a conversation with the people and X, Y, and Z if we're still with this?
Force yourself to be uncomfortable. Like, it sucks. It's not fun, but be uncomfortable so that we can have better lives. And I think that's all we all really want for everybody, is to have a better life. So confront the problems, because if you never confront them, they're still there.
So I guess to summarize, the curse can stop with you. Just remember that. And just because something works doesn't mean it can't be improved. And get comfortable failing. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. When you're finally uncomfortable, then you're realizing, hey, this is where the change needs to be made. Because once you're uncomfortable, you're able to point out what you don't like. Like kind of what Gerald said earlier. I don't want to bring up a new conversation, but like when it comes to relationships, you get in a relationship with somebody and you see that somebody's really about their business, but you find out like, hey, I haven't been about my business all these years because this is what I've been used to versus what the standard should be. So on that note, it's been another episode of Normalize You, and we out.
Peace.
Thanks for watching Normalize You. And don't forget to catch me every other Friday with your question of the week. And you can send in questions as well. Please reach out on our social media or our email and send us your questions, your topics, your responses. We actually do read them. Hope to see you there.